My father, Charles Wallace Farrar, was born at Hungate Lane in Methley in November 1889. He was the fifth child of a family of 4 brothers and 2 sisters. Neither of his Christian names had previously been used by the family, but his second name must have been in remembrance of his grandmother, Anne Wallace. His father, Henry, was brought up at Rudding House Farm in Brackenthwaite, while his mother, Sarah Ann, was the daughter of John Hardcastle, a farmer of Beckwithshire. When the 1891 census was taken at Methley, Charles Wallace was 1 year old. His father was shown to be an agricultural labourer. The places where the siblings were born gives a good idea of how much his parents had moved before settling at Templehurst. The family's strong belief in Methodism was confirmed when their 6th child, Ernest, was baptised in Templehurst Chapel. Charles Wallace was 11 years old when the 1900 census was taken, and though it does not show him as a scholar, it is likely that he attended school at Hurst Courtenay. By then, his father had become a thrashing machine proprietor. This is probably the earliest picture of Charles Wallace, standing on the left outside Bellaby's printing works in Selby. In February 1904, he became an apprentice there to learn the letterpress printing trade. His wage for the first year was to be 4 shillings a week, rising to 9 shillings after 7 years when the apprenticeship would be complete. He signed the agreement W. Farrar, preferring to use Wallace, his second Christian name. He does not appear to be in either of the 2 photographs of the family standing outside the house at Templehurst in the early 1900s. By 1910, the family had moved to Burn to live in a house which became known as Holly House. Then it was licensed and called the Shoulder of Mutton, but the licence was soon lost due to lack of trade. Wallace's father's main income came from thrashing machines, which were kept in a yard behind the house at Burn. In the picture are Wallace's mother, Sarah Ann, with 3 of her sons, Wallace, John Henry and Ernest. It seems unlikely that he completed the apprenticeship. When the census was recorded at Templehurst in 1911, he was described as a traction engine driver, possibly working for his father, and living in the old house by the river with his sister, Ada Ellen, who acted as housekeeper. Wallace was in Burn in 1913 when he wrote a letter announcing of his intention to marry Sarah Annie Armitage at Hemingbreth Chapel a few days later. There is no clue about who the letter was addressed to, but it might have been to her employer, Amos Bell, who farmed at Burn Grange, where Sarah Annie worked as a house servant. Working in the same village where Wallace's parents lived, and as he no doubt visited the grain to thrash corn, they would have had plenty of opportunities to meet. Sarah Annie was born at Leeds, where her father, Fred Armitage, worked as a railway drayman. While she was still young, the Armitages moved to Hemingbreth, where he became a farmer, and Sarah Annie was brought up. After the marriage, Wallace and Sarah Annie moved to a cottage next to Hollybush House at Burn. In 1914, Herbert, the first of 6 children, was born. A few months later, the First World War broke out. Perhaps the biggest impact on the family was the death of Sarah Annie's 2 brothers, Ernest in 1916 and Harry in 1918, shortly before the end of the war. During this time, Horace, the second son, was born. After the war, Wallace returned to Templehurst to live in the old house by the river. Dorothy was born there in 1919. In that year, Wallace, no doubt influenced by his mother, received a letter saying he had been accepted as a Methodist local preacher. He was still working as a thrashing machine driver in 1924 when Mary was born. A few months later, his father, Henry, died. He was buried in Brayton churchyard. When Gertrude was born, it seems likely that the family had moved into a house at Templehurst that stood back from the road near where the school now stands. But in 1929, the family had moved into Holly House at Burn. An early photograph shows Wallace standing on the right of a large group outside the Methodist chapel there, all prepared for a day out at the seaside. In January 1930, Wallace and his eldest son Herbert drove a steam engine nearly 100 miles from Hemingbrooke to Durham. He also drove a variety of equipment, and this photograph shows him with his brother Ernest and a high-powered International Mogul tractor. On the right, behind Mr. Fox, is the body of a bus which could be placed on the lorry and used to take passengers to Selby Market. He must have been one of the first people to operate a bus service in this part of Yorkshire. I was born in 1931. By then my grandmother had left Burn and returned to Harrogate to be near her sisters. She died there in 1934. 2 years later, the family left Burn for good and returned to Templehurst. Because of the move, Wallace was transferred from the Methodist Selby circuit to that of Snaith. Apart from holding services in Templehurst Chapel, he would cycle to other villages in the area to hold Sunday services. He became the owner of his own steam engine and visited local farms to thrash corn. But times were hard and some farmers were unable to pay, offering farm produce instead. Though money was short, some food were often plentiful during the thrashing season. The old house by the river was small, with only 2 rooms up and 2 down. In 1938, a row of 10 3-bedroomed houses were built in the village, and the family moved into number 8. In September the following year, the Second World War broke out, and Wallace became the village air raid warden. Most people built an air raid shelter in their gardens, and we had a telephone installed in the house. When it rang with warning of an air raid, Father had to cycle down the village street, blowing a whistle, warning of impending attack. Few people had a telephone at that time, and it was a big disappointment when, after the war, it was removed. While thrashing at Templehurst Farm, Wallace suffered a shoulder accident, leaving him unable to lift his right arm without assistance, forcing him to give up heavy work and seek other employment. For a time he became an usher at the Hippodrome, standing outside dressed in a uniform, helping customers visiting the cinema. Later he worked as an agent for the Britannic Insurance Company. He purchased an Austin 7 car, similar to this one, so that he could visit potential customers. Sarah Annie earned extra money doing casual work on the farms, working on the land, picking peas or pulling sugar beet, often in bitter cold weather. She would also help in the farmhouse. Though money was short, in 1943 the family were able to go to Blackpool for a week's holiday. Wallace was skilled at repairing clocks and watches, and when dressed up, wore a waistcoat with a pocket watch and a chain. He eventually left the Britannic and opened a watch and clock repair business in a shop in Selby White Street. When the lease expired there, he moved into a similar shop in Redding Lane. In November 1946, Mary and Freddie Bowden were married. Shortly afterwards, Horace married Nora Darley. The following year, a double wedding occurred when Dorothy married Jimmy Swan and Gertrude married William Broom. Mother was an excellent cook and prepared wonderful displays of home-cooked food when family members came for afternoon tea. With no gas or electricity available, she had to cook everything using a coal-fired oven. Eventually, Wallace had to give up the shop. He was diagnosed with a prostate problem and spent some time in Pontefract Hospital. Later, he was moved to Gould Hospital, where, in 1956, he died. Sarah Annie died the following year, and both were buried in Harlesey churchyard.